There is a moment most people never talk about because admitting it hurts too much. The moment you realize you weren't chosen because someone saw your value. You were chosen because you were safe to keep around. Not fully claimed, not fully released. Just closing. You didn't walk into the connection thinking you'd be a backup plan. You showed up honestly, you listened, you stayed consistent, you offered emotional safety without demanding too much. And that's exactly why you fit so perfectly into an avoidance world. In the beginning, it felt like potential, like something slow but meaningful. Like maybe this person just needed time, but underneath that hope, there was a quiet imbalance forming. You were investing emotionally while they were investing strategically. You were building something real while they were making sure they never lost their exit. And the painful truth is this: avoidants don't always choose the person they feel the most for. They choose the person who feels the least risky. And at first, that wasn't you. At first, you were the emotional insurance policy, the one who made loneliness bearable, the one who provided warmth without expectation, the one who didn't push too hard, ask for too much, or demand clarity before they were ready. You were the place they could land when the world felt overwhelming, and they didn't realize how deeply that would mark them until it was gone. An avoidant doesn't build love the way others do. Love, to them, feels like a loss of control before it feels like safety. So instead of moving toward what they feel, they manage what they fear. They don't ask, who do I want? They ask, who won't trust? That's why backup plans aren't always intentional. They're emotional buffers. People who soften the edge of intimacy without threatening it. You weren't there because they didn't care. You were there because they cared just enough to keep you close, but not enough to risk losing themselves. And so the dynamic began. They showed up when they needed comfort, reassurance, grounding. They pulled away when closeness started asking for presence. They gave you just enough vulnerability to keep you emotionally invested, but never enough consistency to feel chosen. And you felt it. That subtle ache. That sense that you were always one step behind something invisible. You told yourself to be patient. You explained their behavior away. You believed that if you loved calmly enough, they would eventually meet you there. But avoidants don't move toward love when it's available. They move toward it when it feels like it's slipping away. Being a backup plan doesn't look like neglect at first. It looks like mixed signals. It looks like deep conversations followed by emotional silence. It looks like intense moments that never translate into steady commitment. It looks like being important, but only on their terms. You were prioritized when they felt lonely, overwhelmed, or disconnected from themselves. You were sidelined when life stabilized or emotions got too close. And slowly, without realizing it, you started shrinking parts of yourself to fit the space they allowed. You didn't ask the questions you deserved answers to. You didn't express needs that felt too much. You waited instead of moving. You stayed emotionally available even when you felt unseen. And the cruel part is this: your patience didn't make them feel safe. It made them feel powerful. Powerful because they could access you without fully choosing you. Powerful because you were there without demanding presence. Powerful because your consistency meant they never had to confront what losing you would feel like until something shifted. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are even more sensitive to emotional absence. And there comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes sudden, when you stop chasing clarity, you stop over-explaining your feelings, you stop adjusting your expectations to meet their limitations. Maybe you didn't announce it. Maybe you didn't threaten to leave. You just changed. Your energy pulled back. Your availability softened. Your focus moved inward. And for the first time, they felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not freedom, impact. The safety net they assumed would always be there suddenly felt unstable. And this is where the shift begins. Because when an avoidant loses emotional access, their attachment doesn't disappear. It activates. They start replaying moments. They start noticing the silence. They start feeling the weight of what your presence used to regulate inside them. And it confuses them because they didn't miss you when you were always there. They miss you now when you're not. That what they didn't understand while you were present is that you weren't replaceable. You were irreplaceably safe. You weren't intense. You weren't chaotic. You weren't demanding. You offered stability without pressure. And avoidants don't recognize safety as value until it's gone. When you were there, your emotional labor blended into the background. When you left, it became loud. They realized too late that you weren't just someone who cared. You were someone who regulated them, someone whose presence lowered their anxiety, someone whose understanding allowed them to function without confronting their own emotional walls. And now, without you, they feel the contrast. Every new connection feels harder. Every new bond feels shallow. Everyone else asks for things you gave freely. And that's when the truth settles in, not as longing, but as permanence. You became the one they'll never forget. Not because you were dramatic or intense, but because you loved them in a way their nervous system learned to depend on. And here's the part that hurts, but also heals. This realization doesn't always bring them back. Awareness doesn't equal readiness. An avoidant can recognize what they lost and still be unable to repair it. But the shift still matters. Because the moment you stopped being the backup plan was the moment you stopped abandoning yourself. You didn't lose them. They lost access to you. And while they carry the imprint of your presence quietly, you carry something more powerful: clarity. You were never second best. You were simply ahead of their emotional capacity. And some people only understand the value of stability once they no longer have a place to rest. And once that clarity settles inside you, something irreversible happens. You begin to see the past differently. Moments that once confused you now make sense with painful precision. You remember how attention came in waves, never steady. How affection showed up right when you were pulling back, but vanished the moment you leaned in. How plans were vague, futures were avoided, and labels felt too heavy. You remember how often you felt chosen emotionally, but not claimed behaviorally. And that's when the realization hits. You weren't imagining the imbalance, you were living inside it. You were there to fill emotional gaps, not to stand beside them fully. You were the safe option during uncertainty, the emotional anchor when they felt ungrounded. And now, looking back, you see how much you gave without ever being fully received. This awareness doesn't make you bitter, it makes you honest. Honest about how much you minimized yourself to stay connected. Honest about how deeply you hoped consistency would change them. Honest about how exhausting it was to be half held. And that honesty hurts, but it also wakes you up. Because once you wake up, you stop romanticizing potential. You stop interpreting inconsistency as depth. You stop calling emotional distance slow love. And this is where avoidants start feeling something shift. Even if they can't name it, your energy changes before your behavior does. You're not reaching out as much. You're not filling silences. You're not explaining your feelings repeatedly just to be understood halfway. You're still kind, still present, but you're no longer overextending. And that subtle withdrawal hits them harder than any confrontation ever could. Avoidants are wired to relax when closeness feels optional. The moment it stops being guaranteed, their nervous system goes on alert. They start checking their phone more. They reread old messages. They notice how quiet things feel without your emotional consistency propping them up. And the irony is brutal. They feel closer to you now that you're further away. This is the phase most people don't understand. When the avoidant suddenly becomes curious. When they ask questions they never asked before. When they reference memories you didn't know mattered. When they show flickers of emotional presence that once felt impossible. But what's really happening isn't growth, it's reaction. They're responding to loss, not choosing intimacy. And this is where your role changes completely. You're no longer trying to prove your value. You're no longer waiting to be seen. You're watching from a grounded distance, realizing that what you wanted from them is now being offered too late, too inconsistently, or too conditionally. And for the first time, you don't feel excited by it. You feel tired because you know that attention born from fear feels very different from attention born from choice. One feels anxious, the other feels steady. And once you felt the difference, you can't unfeel it. Avoidants often don't miss people. They miss regulation. They miss how you made things easier emotionally, how your presence softened their edges, how you didn't push them to feel more than they were ready for. And now, without you absorbing that emotional weight, they feel exposed. Life feels louder. Relationships feel more demanding. They're forced to confront the discomfort they once outsourced to your patience. And this is where the internal conflict begins. They start asking themselves why nothing feels as safe as it used to, why every new connection feels like work, why intimacy suddenly feels heavier than before. And the answer circles back to you, not because you were perfect, but because you were consistent. And consistency to an avoidant is invisible until it's gone. Meanwhile, you're changing in quieter ways. You're learning what it feels like to hold yourself without waiting for someone else to meet you halfway. You're rediscovering parts of yourself that went dormant while you were accommodating emotional distance. Your nervous system begins to settle. You realize how hypervigilant you were before, always scanning for shifts, tone changes, withdrawal. And as that tension releases, something powerful happens. You stop needing closure from someone who couldn't offer presence. You stop waiting for them to understand you. You understand yourself now. And that understanding brings peace, not drama. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply moves on. This is when the avoidance realization deepens because they sense that they've lost something they can't retrieve by trying harder for a moment. You're no longer available in the same way, not emotionally, not energetically. And that's when memory takes over. They remember the way you listened without judgment, the way you stayed calm during their emotional shutdowns, the way you didn't make them feel broken for needing space. They realize you offered acceptance without self-abandonment until it started costing you. And that's when regret enters, not loudly, but persistently, not as desperation, but as comparison. Every connection after you is measured against the safety they once had, and none of them quite land the same. But here's the truth most people don't talk about. Becoming unforgettable doesn't mean becoming chosen later. It means becoming a reference point, a standard, a quiet what if that lives in the background of their emotional life. And that's not a role you aspire to. It's a consequence of loving someone who wasn't ready. You don't stay stuck in that story. You don't wait for them to come back changed. You carry forward the lesson instead. You learn that being someone's backup plan was never about your worth. It was about their fear. And once you see that clearly, you stop internalizing rejection. You stop asking what you could have done differently because the answer is simple and painful. You were already enough. They just couldn't hold what they were given. And this is where the real power shift happens. Not when they miss you, not when they think about you, but when you no longer define yourself by how deeply you affected someone who couldn't stay. You don't need to be unforgettable to feel valuable. You don't need to be remembered to feel whole. You needed to leave, emotionally or physically, so you could finally arrive back to yourself. And while they carry the echo of your presence quietly, you carry something stronger: self-trust. The knowledge that you will never again make yourself small to be someone's safety net. And once you have that, you are no longer anyone's backup plan ever again. And this is where the story turns in a way most people never expect. Because while they are still processing the loss, still replaying moments, still trying to understand why your absence feels heavier than your presence ever did, you are no longer standing in the same emotional place. You are not waiting for recognition. You are not hoping for remorse. You are not looking for proof that you mattered. You already know you did. And that knowing changes how you carry yourself. There's a groundedness now, a quiet boundary that didn't exist before. You no longer feel the urge to prove your depth, your loyalty, or your patience. You've lived through what happens when you give all of that to someone who can't meet you. And once you've felt that cost, something inside you refuses to pay it again. Avoidants often believe distance keeps them safe. But what they don't realize is that distance only delays pain. It doesn't erase it. It just pushes it into the future where it arrives as regret instead of fear. And now they're there, sitting in the aftermath. Not dramatic, not desperate, just quietly haunted by the realization that they lost someone who loved them without trying to control them, someone who accepted their space without disappearing, someone who didn't punish them for pulling away. That kind of love is rare, and it only becomes visible once it's no longer accessible. They begin to understand that what they labeled as too calm was actually emotional maturity. What they saw as easygoing was emotional intelligence. What they took for granted was your ability to stay regulated while they were not. And this realization doesn't feel comforting. It feels exposing. Because now they have to face the truth that the problem was never intensity, timing, or compatibility. The problem was capacity. Meanwhile, you're learning something just as important. You're learning that love should not require you to constantly self-soothe someone else's fear of closeness. You're learning that consistency should be mutual, not earned through silence and patience. You're learning that being chosen should feel clear, not confusing. And as this understanding settles into your body, not just your mind, your standards change, not in a defensive way, not in a bitter way, in a grounded way. You stop entertaining half effort connections. You stop explaining basic emotional needs. You stop calling chemistry what is actually anxiety. And this shift is subtle but profound. Because now, when someone pulls away, you don't chase, you observe. When someone goes quiet, you don't panic, you pause. You are no longer trying to be unforgettable, you are being aligned. This is often when the avoidant feels the strongest pull back toward you. Not because they've healed, not because they've suddenly become secure, but because your detachment feels unfamiliar. It doesn't demand anything, it doesn't plead, it doesn't perform. And that calm distance mirrors back everything they avoided within themselves. They may reach out casually, test the waters, say something nostalgic, something vague, something that leaves the door cracked open just enough. And if this happened before, it might have worked. You might have leaned in hoping this time would be different, but now you feel the difference immediately. You sense the lack of depth beneath the words. You feel the absence of true accountability. And instead of feeling flattered, you feel clear because attention without intention no longer satisfies you. You've already lived that chapter. You're not rereading it. What makes you unforgettable to them isn't that you stayed. It's that you left without burning the house down. You didn't shame them. You didn't beg them. You didn't try to convince them to choose you. You simply stopped abandoning yourself. And that kind of exit leaves an imprint. It forces reflection instead of defensiveness. It creates silence where excuses used to live. And in that silence, they finally hear the truth they spent so long avoiding. That love didn't ask too much of them. It asked them to show up. And they couldn't, not then, maybe not ever. And that realization sits heavy because it can't be undone by one message, one apology, or one moment of vulnerability. Growth requires sustained presence, and that's the very thing they struggle to offer. As for you, you begin to understand that being someone's almost can still lead you to your everything, just not with them. You see how the relationship shaped you, sharpened you, taught you where you overgave, and where you ignored your intuition. You don't regret loving deeply. You regret staying where depth wasn't met, and that distinction matters, because it allows you to carry your capacity for love forward without closing your heart. You don't harden, you don't detach from feeling. You simply redirect it towards someone who can hold it without fear. And this is where healing becomes embodied, not performative. You're not trying to look healed. You are healed enough to walk away from dynamics that once consumed you. Avoidants often think the people they lose will always be there emotionally. That time will soften things. That memory will keep the connection alive. But what they underestimate is the finality of self-respect. Once someone chooses themselves fully, access changes permanently, not out of punishment, out of alignment. And that's the moment they understand the depth of what they lost. Not a relationship, not a person, but a version of themselves that felt safe being loved. And that's why you stay with them in memory, not as longing, but as contrast. As the moment they realize what love feels like when it isn't trying to take something away. And here's the quiet truth that brings everything together. You were never meant to be a backup plan. You were meant to be a mirror. a reflection of what emotional availability looks like when it's offered freely and responsibly. They saw themselves more clearly through you, even if they couldn't stay. And you saw yourself too, stronger than you thought, softer than you feared, capable of leaving without losing your heart. And that's the kind of transformation no one forgets, not them and not you. And now we arrive at the part that most people never talk about out loud because it's not dramatic and it doesn't look like revenge or victory. It looks quiet, it looks ordinary, but it is the most permanent shift of all. This is where you stop being part of their emotional story in real time and become part of their internal history. You are no longer someone they can reach for when they feel unsteady. You are no longer an option. You are a memory and that weight follows them in moments they least expect. When a new connection asks for vulnerability, and they hesitate when someone else offers affection and it feels unfamiliar, when silence feels louder than it used to, they don't always think of you consciously. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a sense that something is missing, that love used to feel calmer, safer, less demanding, and they don't always connect that feeling back to you right away. But eventually they do, because you become the comparison they never meant to make. What they lost wasn't just a person, they lost a dynamic where they were accepted without being chased, loved without being controlled, understood without being fixed. And once that's gone, it can't be recreated by intensity or novelty. It can only be replaced by emotional capacity, something they didn't have then and may still struggle to build now. And this is why you stay with them in a way that others don't. Not as obsession, not as longing, but as a quiet benchmark for what emotional safety feels like. You showed them a version of connection that didn't require armor, and once someone experiences that, even briefly, their nervous system remembers, even if their behavior never fully changes. But here's the part that matters more than what happens inside them. What happens inside you is where the real ending lives. Because by now, you no longer need to be unforgettable to feel whole. You've already integrated the lesson. You understand that being chosen late is not the same as being chosen fully. You understand that regret from someone else does not equal repair. And you understand that love that only shows up after loss is not the kind of love that sustains a future. This isn't bitterness speaking, it's clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from finally trusting your own experience. Instead of questioning it, you stop wondering if you asked for too much. You stop wondering if timing was the issue. You stop wondering if patience would have changed the outcome. Because you see it now, patience didn't fail, capacity did. This is also where compassion becomes clean, not self-sacrificing, not excusing, just honest. You can see that they were doing the best they could with the emotional tools they had, and you can see that their best still wasn't enough for the kind of connection you deserve. Both things can be true without canceling each other out. You don't need to villainize them to move on. You don't need to idealize them to honor what you felt. You simply let the story be what it was. A chapter that taught you how deeply you can love and how important it is that love is met. And that understanding frees you. Because now, when someone shows you distance, you don't chase closeness. You recognize incompatibility. When someone keeps you in uncertainty, you don't wait for clarity. You choose yourself. And that choice becomes instinct, not effort. For the avoidant, this is where the realization settles permanently, not in a moment of heartbreak, but in repetition. Each time they pull away from someone new and feel that familiar emptiness. Each time they wish connection felt easier. Each time they remember someone who didn't demand more than presence. And slowly they understand that you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for something they didn't know how to give. And that realization doesn't always lead to change, but it does lead to honesty. An honesty that arrives too late for you, but just in time for their growth, if they choose it. And that's the final role you played in their life. Not the one who stayed forever, but the one who showed them what was possible. And here's the ending. Most people don't expect. You don't walk away hardened. You walk away softer, but wiser. You don't shut down your heart. You protect it with discernment instead of fear. You don't lose your capacity for patience. You redirect it towards someone who can meet it. You don't regret being someone's backup plan because you now understand it was never a reflection of your value. It was a reflection of their readiness. And that distinction changes everything because it allows you to move forward without carrying shame, resentment, or self doubt. You loved fully. You showed up honestly. You left when it cost you yourself. That is not a loss. That is integrity. So when you think back on this connection one day, it won't sting the way it used to. It won't feel unfinished. It will feel complete. You'll recognize it as the moment you learned the difference between being needed and being chosen, between being remembered and being held, between being someone's emotional refuge and being someone's partner. And you'll know without question that you were never meant to stay where you had to earn consistency. You were meant to move on to a love where presence is natural, not negotiated. You were an avoidance backup plan for a season, and then you became something far more permanent than a partner they couldn't keep. You became the lesson that reshaped how they understand connection, the standard they didn't know they were setting, the love they will quietly measure others against. And you became something even more important for yourself, someone who finally chose themselves without losing their ability to love. And that is the kind of ending that doesn't need closure. It speaks for itself.